world of work is so important to so many people, but I would argue that for most of us, the world of work is broken. This is because we spend most of our time in environments and in business cultures that were designed in the industrial age and weren't designed for the way the world is today. I would argue that businesses need to fundamentally change their ways of working to reflect the way the world is and not the way the world was. And if they don't change, they face becoming irrelevant to a new generation of employees that see work differently. And they don't just see it as somewhere that they come into between the hours of 9 to 5 every day to exchange their time just for a paycheck. So why now? Why am I standing here today talking to you about work? Well, to answer that question, I want to reflect on some of my experiences in my early career when I was a marketer. My job then was to understand this changing customer, and businesses knew full well that these customers were changing due to the environment outside. And my job was to understand how they ticked and to work out new ways to engage them. Yet while I was doing all of this work, I would then look back into the organisation and go, why aren't you changing inside as well? Because surely the people that you're hiring are very similar to the people that you're selling to. And then as I worked for more and more businesses, it became really clear. They didn't change their ways of working because they didn't have to. They knew that so many other businesses operated under exactly the same model that they did, that if their employees were unhappy where they were, if they went and worked for the business down the road, they're going to be equally as unhappy there. And another thing, they thought, well, they're not going to go out and set up their own business because you need loads of money and you need to have a huge network. And if you didn't have that, there was no worry of you going to disappear either. So the answer to it was tough. If you're not happy, you just got to put up with it. However, things have started to change. And there's a new type of employee coming into the workplace. And the majority of them are millennials. So many of you may have heard this phrase. It's well overused. But for those of you that haven't, millennials are people that were born between the early 1980s and the late 1990s. So they come into the workforce after the millennium, hence their name. This generation, just like every other generation before them, was shaped by their environment. And I think the two biggest things that this generation were impacted by were the recession and access to the internet. So let's talk about the recession. Most of these individuals have spent their entire career in a post-recessionary period. They saw friends and loved ones that had been loyal to their organisations for years lose their jobs overnight, which showed to them that loyalty meant nothing in the world of business. They also saw the impact that big business did, and they lost a lot of trust in how in big business and what they were doing. And they saw the impact that austerity had on society, and it really made them question their own spending habits and what really was success, and do I really need to own all those things, or would I much rather have experiences? The second thing that impacted them was access to the internet. So like no other generation before, they had access to the world's knowledge just at the click of a button. So they could literally fulfill their endless curiosity by going online. And other things they could do is they could connect to anyone in the world as long as they had an internet connection. And another thing the internet did was it just provided an endless amount of content informing them of what was going on in the world like no other generation had seen before. So whether this was war, conflict, environmental disasters, they were just aware of things that were going on much more than generations before. So bearing this in mind with these two big things which has shaped their mindset, they then went into this world of work, which was based on the industrial age, and they started asking questions. Why are you doing things like this? Why are you behaving like that? It doesn't make any sense. And actually, it just got met with, that's just how we do things here. And they caused a lot of conflict between the generations in the workplace. But around the same time, a new type of organisation started to emerge. So whether they were started by millennials themselves, so just think Facebook, set up by Mark Zuckerberg, or they were a business that was set up in this new world. They understood what was going on, and they made these new ways of working at the heart of how the business was run. What this did is this shifted the balance of power between employers and employees. because suddenly it gave an opportunity for all these millennials that didn't feel as though they fitted into this traditional world of work to go and work somewhere else that was much more aligned with how they wanted to do things. So this led to a mass exodus of millennial talent, all moving to these organisations. And they started to experience all sorts of different things from working there. But actually, on the face of it, it seems as though it was a bit of a silly move. And what I mean by that is they were leaving traditional organisations with good salaries, pensions, the opportunity to progress, to go and work in these new types of organisations that perhaps, particularly in the case of startups, may go out of business within 6 months' time, certainly didn't have the gold-plated pension, and often didn't have the same amount of salary as what they would experience at the traditional companies. So, being a millennial myself, at the older end of the spectrum, I was really intrigued about what was going on. So I actually switched and took the leap myself. I went to work in many of these different businesses, and I immersed myself in the startup world. And what I found was 6 key things that a lot of these new businesses were doing that the traditional businesses simply weren't. The first one was a real sense of purpose. And when I say a real sense of purpose, I mean not one of those documents that sits in the drawer gathering dust, talking about vision, mission, and values, as we heard earlier. Because actually that didn't really drive the organisation at all. All it did was serve a purpose of looking good on the wall. And actually, these new organisations, they really did have a compelling vision. And that compelling vision was really built into the way they operated, the way they behaved, and it gave these people working in them a real sense of purpose. And actually, from a millennial perspective, they were often beaten over the head for being really lazy, but I saw them working 60+ hours a week. So it wasn't the fact that they were lazy, they just weren't motivated to work in a world that was completely different to theirs. The second thing I noticed was there was a huge focus on personal development. Now, if you look in a lot of traditional organisations, personal development was pretty much an annual performance review. Just think of that. You've got to wait a year to find out if you did something good or did something bad. The second thing was you might have a few classroom-based training, but that probably took a year to get through HR, another year to get through finance. So by the time you did it, it was a 3-year-old course. So was that really going to add value to your career and your own personal development? So what these new businesses were doing was they were looking at innovative new ways to allow people to develop, and they trusted them to do it as well. So they'd say, here's a budget, you go and spend it on whatever personal development you need, whether that's access to an online course or even acting classes. Whatever you feel is appropriate for you, we will help you. They also encourage things like side jobs or doing things for charity, because they knew that the skills they would learn outside of work would directly benefit what they were doing inside of work. The third one, and I think probably the biggest one that needs to be overcome, is the evolution of the hierarchy. Now, many businesses, particularly traditional businesses, the hierarchy is the foundation of how they operate. But actually, I would argue it's more harm than good. Let me give you an example. If I'm really, really good at something, I get promoted quicker into a position such as a management position, where I then spend less time doing the thing that got me there in the first place. Another thing that they do as well with the hierarchies is by default, as you go up the hierarchy, there's fewer and fewer positions. So what that created was this constant state of tension and stress where people were competing with each other, maneuvering themselves, playing office politics, fighting against each other to make sure that they got promoted first, rather than focusing on the real job, which was to work together and focus on beating the competition. In many of these new organisations, they adopted new ways of working, which was all about collaboration. Now, there's lots of different models out there, but the one I saw work really well was one called holacracy. And holacracy is self-organising teams. It was saying, based on the work that we've got, we're going to form a virtual team within our office, and we're going to allow the person to lead that to be the person with the most amount of skills in that area. So it didn't matter if that was someone that was an intern that had been there for a month. If it was a particularly focused project where that person was brilliant and they'd just done their thesis on it, they should lead that project. But that took a huge removal of ego, and it meant that you didn't do things based on your job title. And that was a fundamental difference, and the amount of that changed the way businesses operate was huge. And another thing they did about this whole idea of collaboration and the removal of the hierarchy was they did things like shared equity schemes or shared profit schemes where you got money based on the combined output of the team, not as you as an individual or where you were in the hierarchy. The fourth thing they did was they changed the way they communicate. So I'm sure if any of you in here are working in a corporate environment, you would agree that the primary forms of communication are emails and face-to-face meetings. And what I found was people would go into work and do loads of emails, loads of face-to-face meetings, and they'd actually do their work at home. And that's absolutely ludicrous. The place where you do work is not at work. So what was happening in a lot of these new organizations was they were just changing the paradigm, and they were saying, we're going to do stand-up meetings. We're going to do walking meetings. We're going to limit meetings to 30 minutes. Or we're going to use tools that just do a daily digest of all the cool stuff that's happened today. So if I want to check it at midnight before I go to bed, I can do that. But if I want to do it on the commute on the way in, I can do that too. It was about facilitating communication and allowing people to do their job and do something that they were passionate about. Another thing they did with regards to communication was they just allowed people to use the tools they were so used to using outside of work. So inside of work, it's, no, you can't use that, you can't use Facebook, can't do this. But actually outside of work, you were on WhatsApp to contact a certain friend or do group bookings or whatever you wanted to do, but you weren't allowed to use that in work. And actually, the business just got out of the way in these new organizations and allowed employees to do what they needed to do to get the job done. The fifth thing that they did was they saw business as a force for good. Now, again, going back to what I was saying earlier about how a lot of these millennials were shaped by the recession, a lot of them didn't want to be part of the same system and perpetuate this really bad behaviour that led to a lot of the problems that they'd witnessed for most of their career. So they turned their back on it and instead wanted to work for an organisation where, of course, profit was important, but it wasn't at the detriment to the planet and it wasn't at the detriment to people, whether they were inside or outside of the organisation. And actually, work became a lot more than just turning up and exchanging your time for money. It was about being part of something and about doing something where business was a genuinely positive force for good. The final thing they did was they focused very, very heavily on flexible working. And this was really, really important. And the key thing about flexible working is nothing to do with technology. It's all to do with trust. Basically, there's this paradigm and this mindset in many traditional organizations that if you're not sat in that seat, you are not doing your job. And that is absolutely crazy, because if you think about it, most of us have got better smartphones than what work gives us. We've certainly got better laptops. We've got fast internet at home for the majority of us. So actually, we could be more productive at home than we could ever be in the office. Plus, we won't have someone bothering us every time we go and get a cup of tea. But this flexible working wasn't just about being able to work from home in your pajamas. It was about being trusted to get on and do your job to the best that you could do it, irrespective of when or where that was. And what that's done, that's opened up an entire new industry as well, such as whether they were stay-at-home parents that wanted to then go back to work flexibly, or the rise of, you've seen the digital nomad. They want to go traveling around the world but work at the same time. So those are the key things that I saw that businesses were doing that were really attracting this new type of employee. But I saw a huge increase in entrepreneurialism too, or freelancing as well. And what was key to that was, why was there suddenly this big shift of people going out on their own? It was because the barriers to entry had dramatically decreased because of the internet. So things that would have taken huge teams of experts or huge budgets in the past, now you could do online with free automated tools. You could also go on YouTube and watch how to learn how to use that tool, and you could get loads of free content online in terms of how do you build a website, how do you get your first clients. There was also this huge marketplace that had opened where all it did was match up supply and demand. So I could be working in London but get a job working for someone out in Singapore, and it was a perfect match that I never would have had before. So hopefully you can see that there's this new type of organisation operating in new ways. And there's also the option of being an entrepreneur. But what that meant was there was a whole range of options open to employees that weren't available before. But actually, I've been talking about millennials for a lot of this. It's much, much bigger than that. If we were to look at just a normal adoption curve, millennials were just the early adopters because they didn't have anything else to overwrite. This is all they knew. Instead, this is the way of working that everybody wanted to do, but only now are the other generations starting to see the value. And as more and more of these businesses operate in these new ways and become more and more successful, more and more businesses started to follow suit. So for me, this is giving rise to the modern employee and not just looking at millennials. And actually, what's really interesting is a lot of traditional businesses are really starting to notice now. They are having to change because they're finding it very, very difficult to attract, engage and retain this new modern employee. And I think Jack Welch, the former chairman and CEO of General Electric, summed this up very well when he said, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. Now, that may be a little bit dramatic, but there's certainly a few CEOs that are worrying now because there's people that just don't want to work in the environment that they're providing. So my final thought is this. There's a new type of employee for a new type of organisation. Those businesses that adapt will thrive, and those businesses that don't will disappear. My question is, which business do you want to be? Thank you.